Whenever you tell people that you're a teacher, there are a number of predictable responses. One of the most common is for the non-teacher to express admiration or approval, only to then say something along the lines of, "I couldn't do that. The kids would drive me insane. I'd end up lamping one of them and getting sent down." The implication being that all kids are massively disobedient, unruly, and feral. Not to mention that teachers have some kind of superhuman level of patience that allows them to remain entirely stoic in the face of these insolent, indolent little wretches. Of course, it isn't really like that. If you're even half decent at what you do and your lessons are good enough to hold the kids' interest, then you don't really have to worry about discipline half as much as people make out. At the end of the day, that conversation, which I was well rehearsed, amounts to a cliché. A lazy cookie cutter, cut and paste bit of conversational back and forth that the speaker had probably never put any real thought into, but decided to wheel out anyway. The biggest joke about the whole thing being that for a teacher, the kids are seldom the problem. The real kickers, the things that get to most teachers, and even the things that stop some of them from continuing in the profession, are the three-piece pointless meetings, paperwork, and parents. It's the last of these that is most overlooked. The average Joe who has never done any teaching seems always to assume that it would be the students that cause the teachers the biggest headaches. I'm here to tell you, speaking from many years of experience, that parents are far worse. Annoying parents come in a wide variety of flavors, but every one of them is just as much a pain in the arse as the others. For example, there are the pushy parents, the ones who want to make sure that their little Johnny, who happens to have all the academic prowess of a dead goldfish, has the best possible opportunities. These parents are happy to harass the teacher with emails and phone calls at all hours of the night, second-guessing curriculum choices, teaching methods, and even marking. They become micromanagers in a management structure they are not actually a part of, and seem to believe that the more they lean on the teacher, the more their utterly disinterested offspring will flourish. This particular species of parent comes in two subspecies, one of which is never satisfied with the teacher, and the other is never satisfied with the pupil. I can't tell you how many times I have sat opposite stern-looking fathers at parents' evening, giving their child the most glowing report I could possibly manage, only to be shot down by a father who seemed to hear nothing of what had been said and was determined to go home and chastise the child. He got 98% on the test, I'd say, expecting the father to be proud.
So he dropped marks. He is weak in some areas.
Well, no. He may have made one or two errors, but 98% is an exceptionally high score. I mean, for comparison, the national average is 46% and the closest mark in his class was 75%.
Still, it's not 100, is it? He needs to work harder. No more internet and an extra hour of study each night. We will be having strong words when I get home.
I'm not sure I'm making myself clear. Your son is wildly above average in this subject. He is achieving well above the expected level, and you couldn't possibly ask for more.
There is more, 2% more. I am sorry he let you down. It will not happen again, I can assure you.
And so on. This may sound extreme, but I guarantee almost every teacher you know will have had this experience. It's a sort of overzealous neglect or loving cruelty. Of course, at the other end of the scale, there were the parents who never showed up at all, never answered emails or phone calls, and seemed to assume that once the child left the house for school in the morning, they somehow ceased to exist. They felt no responsibility to or for the child's education or even well-being, and were far more interested in their own lives than anything the kid might be involved in. Luckily, the second category is in the minority. The first is abundant, and it's safe to say that Mrs. Nichols was a fully fledged member, if not a potential leader. Hardly a week went by when there wasn't some kind of note or phone call from Mrs. Nichols to me about her son Andrew. Whether she was asking about the homework, bothering about whether I had read a particular book about a historical period I was teaching, or even asking to see my lesson plans for the following term so she could plan ahead to support Andrew at home, she would not leave me alone. For the record, I never provided lesson plans for the simple reason that at the time she asked I hadn't written them, and even when the time came, my lesson plans tended to be shorthand scribbled notes intended for my eyes only, since I would be the only one teaching the damn class. After the incident with Gemma, I expected to hear from Mrs. Nichols immediately. As it happened, 3 weeks went by and I saw neither Mrs. Nichols nor Andrew. He simply stopped turning up for school. According to my colleagues, this wasn't the first time that Andrew had vanished from classes. A few years earlier, before I had begun teaching at the school, he had become so frustrated by a maths teacher who kept getting the sums wrong that he stood up in the middle of the lesson, calmly packed his bag up and walked out. When the teacher tried to challenge him about it, he apparently said they should spend less time worrying about him and more time learning to count. Andrew didn't come back to school for 6 weeks, but the maths teacher in question swears to this day that the abacus he received in his pigeonhole the following week was sent by Andrew as a joke. One which I have to admit I said was appalling at the time, but privately found quite funny. What was not funny was his sudden absence now. I knew it wasn't anything I had done. If anything, Andrew had been more enthusiastic in recent weeks, staying behind after class and quizzing me on texts so thoroughly that eventually I had to tell him to give me a lead-in. I haven't read every book on this stuff ever written, mate. I have a full-time job. If you let me know what you want to talk about, I'll read up on it in advance, but I can't be expected to know everything. He seemed to understand this and, in a comical reversal of roles, presented me with a reading list. I knew why Andrew was absent. It was because of the thing with Gemma, when her jaw had mysteriously and inexplicably imploded in front of a class full of other kids. The idea that he had something to do with it terrified me, and yet I still thought if I could talk to him, maybe I could help in some way. When he was absent for 2 days straight, I asked the other teachers if anyone had heard anything. When it got to a week, I asked the kids, hoping that they would reveal some nugget of gossip that the other staff members wouldn't tell me. Maybe a science teacher dismissed the theory of evolution, or an English teacher had forgotten Byron and Shelley mixed up or something. Perhaps there was some other reason for his absence, and I was just imagining things. They didn't come back with anything concrete, except a comment that in recent weeks Andrew had been getting into some dark stuff. What was most striking about Andrew's absence was that his mother was absent too. I would have imagined that if he did not attend school, she would have been up at the head's office to complain within minutes. Instead, she was entirely absent and did not respond to emails or phone calls. Until that was, she decided to turn up one evening at my classroom door. To say she didn't look her best would be an understatement. In fact, she looked, as my grandmother used to say, like she'd been dragged through a hedge backwards. More than her unkempt appearance, though, it was her eyes that worried me. Hay had the look in them of someone who had not only been crying but had been doing so for far too long. It was the same look you saw in The Recently Bereaved, and seeing it on her face here now scared me half to death. I invited her into the classroom and told her to take a seat, which she did, plonking herself heavily onto one of the plastic chairs. Before I could ask where Andrew had been or why he hadn't shown up to lessons for nearly a fortnight, his mother began to cry.
"You have to help me,"
she sobbed.
"You have to. He's been up there for days and he's..."
She trailed off for a moment before taking a deep inhalation through her nose and forcing herself to sit upright. Then, after taking a few moments to steady herself, she said it.
"He's been up there nearly a week and he's been making things."
It was a very simple phrase, yet somehow the way she said it, the look in her eyes, and the quivering, tremulous shaking of her voice made the words mean so much more. When she repeated them again, this time lower and more stable, the words chilled me to the bone.
"He's been making things,"
she repeated. An hour after speaking to Mrs. Nichols in my classroom, I found myself in an uncomfortable and unlikely situation, standing at the top of the stairs in her small 2-up, 2-down house, knocking firmly on the door of her son's room. As I did so, 2 things immediately struck me. Firstly, the way that Mr. Nichols steadfastly refused to ascend those stairs. She stood at the bottom, her hand clasped firmly around the banister, and stared desperately up at me in expectant silence. Had the trembling of that grasping hand not given it away, then the tiny glimpse of the living room would have. Andrew's mother was no longer concerned about Andrew's welfare. She was concerned about her welfare and what he might do. She was, as always, protective of her son, but she was also terrified. From my position at the top of the stairs, I could still make out the old battered couch with a pillow and pink duvet spread across it. I could see the small coffee table positioned beside it, on which rested a pair of woman's glasses, a few female toiletries, and tellingly a large black-handled kitchen knife, just in case. I knocked again, noting as I did the second striking thing, the lack of sound. Mrs. Nichols' house was on a residential street, surrounded by other such houses filled with families, kids, barking dogs, and revolving engines. Yet, when I had stepped into her home and she had closed the front door behind her, I was suddenly struck by the most awesome stillness. It was not that the walls were thick, the windows double glazed or in some other way soundproofed. This was something else. It was not simply a silence, but an unsound. As if what sound had been contained within had been erased and scrubbed out. The space within those walls seemed to be on mute. I knocked again, trying as I tried not to think about the places where I had read about such quiet, about how sorcerers of old would cleanse the space in and around their practice areas and would create within it air that felt to anyone who entered it. Like an airtight container, devoid of life and sound. A bleached space, like some kind of breathable vacuum, free of all pollutants save for those made or conjured by the mage himself. After one more knock, I tried the door. To my surprise, it opened easily. For some reason, I had expected it to be locked. If it was open all along, then why had not Andrew's mother opened it herself? I turned to look back at Mrs. Nichols and confirmed with one snatched glance of her terrified, tear-glassed eyes precisely why she had not opened the door. Back in my classroom, she had told me of the sounds she had heard coming from that room, of how Andrew scurried up the stairs every day, holding things. Bundles were concealed beneath his jacket and would not come out until it was time to leave in the morning. She said how she had tried to speak with him, but he had simply ignored her, and of how he would howl and cry at all hours of the night and early morning. She spoke of the strange smells that would drift and waft down the stairs, from exotic perfumes and incense to foul stenches like long-rotted meat. Opening the door, I was struck by how dark the place was. Every wall was painted black and covered over either with horror movie posters or sigils torn directly from books like the Asketia. There were books piled everywhere, papers adorned with symbols, circles, and other strange rites, letters that I recognized as being from Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew scripts. Candles and incense burners littered the floor alongside fragments of tree bark, bone, fur, precious stones, and other materials clearly used in operations that Andrew had been attempting. At the back of the room, the window stood wide to the world and a black curtain flapped and tugged at its rings as it attempted to escape in the same direction as its owner. Below the window and winding itself back toward the desk was a silvery trail made of a viscous, mucus-like liquid of the kind you might expect to be made by a slug or snail. This trail, however, could not have been made by any such a creature, as it stretched several feet across and covered the distance between the desk and window, as if someone had been carrying a bucket full of the stuff and had allowed it slosh clumsily over the edges and onto the ground as they moved. Whilst the room and this strange liquid were undoubtedly gruesome sights, it was what I found resting on that desk that turned my stomach and made the panic leap like a tennis ball made of lead up into the base of my throat. On the desk, lit by the desk lamp that provided the only illumination in the room, was a small shoebox containing what appeared to be 3 very large white chicken eggs of the type you could buy at any supermarket. Only these were not your usual eggs. For rather than containing the usual albumen and yolk, the smashed tops of these eggs, perforated from the inside, revealed that they had either come close to hatching or had in fact hatched. For a moment, I wondered if Andrew had been trying somehow to nurture chicks, but a closer look immediately disabused me of that notion. For at the top of one of the eggs, dangling limply over the side like a plump grey worm, was an arm. A tiny arm. Not a wing or the leg of some creature, but an arm, complete with hand and long tapered fingers. On each finger, each no larger than the tip of a toothpick, there were tiny, perfectly formed fingernails. In proportion, the hand was adult, resembling my own hand rather than that of a newborn or child. The arm traced up to a shoulder that leaned slackly to one side, but hinted at the rest of a form still slumped and concealed within the shell of the egg from which it had attempted to escape, and across the entire thing, the same hideous liquid that ran from the desk to the window. Moving toward the eggs, I carefully moved some shards with the end of a biro I found, cutting slightly through what seemed to be a layer of thick, spongy sacking. Sure enough, inside and curled up in an almost fetal position was what appeared to be a tiny man, no more than 3 inches in height, hairless, grey like a newborn bird, and entirely smooth with no facial features whatsoever. It was only as I snapped back, shaking my head and asking myself over and over what the hell was going on, that I realised I was screaming. It was also then that I finally caught sight of the book lying open on Andrew's desk. Immediately, I assumed it to be some book of magic that he had acquired through some nefarious means, perhaps from some dark corner of the internet or from people who were neither as committed nor as focused as Andrew and had been unable to unlock its secrets. Cautiously lifting the thing and sifting through its pages, however, it soon became clear that the volume was, in fact, something far worse. It was a leather-bound notebook with pages of almost A3 size, each covered all over with a tiny, closely printed script and illustrated with strange symbols and diagrams, similar to those that decorated the walls of Andrew's bedroom. I did not have time to read through the contents, but flipping to the front page, I did manage to read the title. Where Andrew had acquired this book, how he had paid for it or what he had given in exchange for it, I did not know. What I did know was that those few short sentences scared me more than any I had ever read before. They made me scared for Andrew, scared for myself, and scared, in fact, for the whole of the town. The title read as follows: "This is the true magical grimoire of Thomas Blackwell, the Werewolf of Morton,